By 1942, John Ford's movies had racked up dozens of Academy Award nominations, and he'd won 3 Oscars for Best Director.
John Ford.
John Ford.
Of course, he didn't go to a single ceremony. He didn't even seem to think filmmaking was an honorable or glamorous job.
I never cared that much. Just a way of making a living, like the man digging the ditch.
But Ford did feel like he had something to prove. It just wasn't in Hollywood.
I think one of the great honors an American citizen can have is to wear the uniform of his country at some time or other.
More than anything, John Ford wanted to serve in the military. It's one of the contradictions of Ford. This man who didn't respect fame, authority, or power of any kind worshipped the military, one of the most hierarchical organizations you could join. He came by that worship honestly.
My father was not an American. He had an idea, a good sound American idea. If every American citizen, the proudest thing he could do is to wear the uniform of his country.
Every American conflict of the last 50 years had a Fenian uniform, Feeney being Ford's last name at birth. But every time Ford tried to follow in their footsteps, he struck out. As a boy, he dreamed of attending the Naval Academy, but he couldn't get past the entrance exam. In the First World War, he tried to become a combat photographer. They turned him down on account of his bad vision. Pressure to serve only multiplied after Ford got married. He met Mary McBride Smith at a St. Patrick's Day dance in 1920. They tied the knot that July. She was beautiful, and she shared his taste for whiskey, along with his family ties to military service.
She came from an old Confederate family. They were DAR.
DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution. This is their grandson, Dan Ford.
She had an uncle who had been the Surgeon General of the United States, and he was a Navy admiral, and a lot of her family had been in the military. And her brother Wingate was an extremely highly decorated soldier in World War I.
Ford admitted to Katharine Hepburn that all that military heritage weighed on him heavily.
Did the fact that she was a sort of military family give you a feeling of being inadequate and true, and gave you a push to amount to something in her eyes?
Mary was an officer, so it was a pretty tough courtship.
Yes.
After all those years trying to make his way into the military, Ford snuck in kind of a side door after buying his boat, the Ariner, when the Navy pulled him into those spying missions, looking for suspicious Japanese boats. He joined the Naval Reserves.
In a lot of ways, it was his way of proving to her that he was more than shanty Irish, that he was a real American.
He purchased every kind of Navy uniform there was, kept them all in pristine condition, which, you'll remember, was not at all how he usually dressed.
Now, you know he was a world's worst dresser. I mean, his idea of dressing up was an old pair of flannel pants or jeans and a fatigue jacket.
Ford and his father were close, so once he was finally in the reserves, he rushed to tell his dad the good news.
He was disgusted. He said, "What the hell kind of service is that?" I said, "That's part of the United States." He says, "That's no service. Why don't you get out and join the Army? Join the National Guard. Join the Sheridan Rifles, which is strictly an Irish outfit."
The terrible irony is that Ford's father would have been incredibly proud of his youngest son if he had lived just a few years longer. But his dad died in 1936. Before John Ford made his way to the front lines of some of World War II's biggest battles, rising in rank along the way and putting his own life in danger.
Battle of Midway blazed forth in all its mighty fury.
So when we arrived, I mean, the ship was still ablaze.
It was really bad. An utter, complete slaughterhouse.
Casualties may reach a dreadful toll.
I'm your host, Ben Mankiewicz. You are listening to Season 5 of The Plot Thickens, a podcast from Turner Classic Movies. Each season, we bring you an in-depth story about the movies and the people who make them. This season, we partnered with Novel for Decoding John Ford, the most influential filmmaker of the last 100 years. This is Episode 3, The Commander. Before John Ford made his way to the front lines, he first had to pay his dues. He got his chance in 1941. When the government reinstated the draft, the War Department needed help convincing the public to send their sons off to fight in yet another foreign war. So Washington turned to Hollywood.
They were essentially to make propaganda films that would explain to American soldiers why they were fighting.
Mark Harris is the author of Five Came Back, a story of Hollywood and the Second World War.
The War Department thought filmmaking can be a great motivator of patriotism, and we don't know how to do it, so we should subcontract this, essentially, to people who do.
Ford got hired to make a film for the military, an important one too, though probably not in the way he'd hoped.
Let us study the male anatomy. This gland is called the prostate.
It was a sex ed film for recruits. The military needed to stir up patriotic feelings, but they also needed more practical content.
However, in the event of contact with a contaminated woman,
like teaching new recruits how to avoid catching a venereal disease while serving overseas. It wasn't the sexiest job, but it was for the military, so Ford took it seriously, even had a little fun with it.
On that slide, there are many germs that you cannot see with the unaided eye.
He staged it as a classroom lesson, with soldiers seated at desks, while a menacing doctor lectured them.
Most men know less about their own bodies than they do about their automobiles.
The director, known for his beautiful panoramas, leaned more on close-ups for this film,
Gonorrhea,
zooming in on oozing genital sores and cutting to soldiers' horrified faces.
This is the specific germ of syphilis. These germs, if allowed to enter the body, may destroy your life.
When the first batch of training films were screened for the press in August, Variety said Ford's sex hygiene was the best by far. Apparently Ford could even make syphilis compelling.
The advice you have just heard is sound.
A lot of people in Hollywood got into the war effort, making training films, doing USO tours. John Ford went further. He built his own military reconnaissance unit, but it should be emphasized, he did this without anyone in the military asking him to.
Well, field photo was really largely John Ford's idea.
That's film historian Mark Harris again. Ford called his rogue unit the Field Photographic Service. He started creating it years before the United States even got involved in World War II.
I mean, it was when a lot of filmmakers and a lot of Americans weren't really necessarily thinking that the United States' entry into World War II was inevitable. Ford really did feel that way.
Ford called everyone he knew in Hollywood to convince them to join this unofficial unit. Directors, cinematographers, sound guys. Over time, Ford recruited more than 100 men. On Tuesdays, he'd run them through military-style exercises.
A kind of weekly form of basic training where they would run drills and figure out how to shoot and edit movies on the fly. And he loved sort of marches and drills and formation.
Ford took it all seriously, and sometimes took it a little too far.
It was basically a cross between pre-war training and this weirdly ceremonial, almost hobbyish thing that Ford was interested in, where at one point he wanted all of the officers in his weekend training unit to be able to carry swords.
When the Navy called Ford up for active duty in September 1941, He told them about Field Photo, said, "I've got the best filmmakers in the world trained up and ready to document the war." He offered to bring the unit with him. The Navy said thanks, but no thanks. So Ford pitched Field Photo to someone else.
He was very kind, courteous, soft-spoken, and belied his nickname of Wild Bill Donovan.
William Wild Bill Donovan had just created a new spy agency called the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. Today, we call it the CIA. It was probably inevitable that Ford would respect Donovan. He had Ivy League degrees, but also had the scrappiness of a boxer from the rough end of Buffalo, New York. Most importantly, though, Bill Donovan was Irish. He earned his nickname because of the bravery he showed as the leader of the Fighting Irish Regiment in World War I. Warner Brothers actually made a movie about his exploits.
George Brent as Wild Bill Donovan, leader of the Shamrock Battalion.
Donovan was a highly decorated officer. It was like he had a military EGOT, Medal of Honor, Silver Star, Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Purple Hearts. You name it, Wild Bill Donovan wore it on his well-defined chest. When John Ford pitched his film unit to Donovan, Wild Bill could see what the Navy couldn't. Having the greatest living filmmaker document this war, making propaganda for the U.S., that would be huge. He told Ford, "I want you and your unit in the OSS," and he had Ford report directly to him. Suddenly, John Ford wasn't merely in the military. He was one step away from the top. Only Bill Donovan stood between him and President Roosevelt, the commander-in-chief. The men Ford brought with him to the OSS were some of Hollywood's best and brightest, some of whom went on to become Hollywood royalty.
None of them were, drunks he picked up on Skid Row.
Ford biographer Scott Iman.
Ford was very particular about who he brought into the Field Photo Service. He recruited high-end industry professionals. I mean, these guys were either already established as forces to be reckoned with within the film industry, or would soon be recognized as forces to be recognized in the film industry.
People like this guy.
I was working on some picture that he was doing, and he told me about a Navy unit that he was forming, and that he was getting some equipment together.
That's Robert Parrish. Son of a Coca-Cola salesman from Georgia, he first met Ford as an 11-year-old child actor. Soon, the old man was showing him how to edit film. Parrish went on to become an Oscar-winning editor on films like Body and Soul and All the King's Men. First, though, he joined Ford's unit.
We were all sworn in immediately into active service and taken to Washington.
Sworn in with Parrish was Greg Toland, Ford's cinematographer on The Grapes of Wrath. Toland was a delicate guy, kind of sickly, with a pencil mustache like Clark Gable. Toland walked with a bit of a stoop, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. As a cameraman, though, he made films look beautiful. When the war came, he had just finished shooting a little movie called Citizen Kane. And then there was Mark Armistead, a kid Ford plucked from a Hollywood camera rental company and made his right-hand man.
My first meeting with, yes, I recall it very vividly. First thing he did was say, "Square that hat, sailor."
The more time Armistead spent with Ford, the more he realized his new boss was kind of a handful. While they were in D.C. waiting for their first mission, Armistead and some other officers lived on board an abandoned yacht. Ford would drop by sometimes to bunk with the guys. He always took the captain's quarters for himself. Not that he used to sleep. Ford was a nocturnal creature. He'd send Armistead out on errands in the middle of the night and keep him up till sunrise, drinking and talking.
I'd probably know more about his drinking than any man alive.
Ford would leave in the morning. and Armistead would be stuck washing Ford's filthy sheets and sweeping up the cigar ash and candy wrappers that littered the floor. Armistead would get very good at cleaning up John Ford's messes. Before the war was over, he saw Ford at one of the lowest, most pathetic points in his life. But for now, in 1941, Ford was the boss.
This was really John Ford's Navy, and we did things the way he wanted them done, and that was it.
It really was John Ford's unit. Even though it was part of the military, Ford's boss, Wild Bill Donovan, knew how to delegate.
Donovan gave his people, the men he regarded as his people, a great deal of autonomy, which Ford needed psychologically and practically. He didn't deal well with a lot of supervision.
John Ford found, under Wild Bill Donovan, a corner of the military where his rebellious spirit could thrive, where he could do things his way. Coming up, Ford and his unit go to war and find themselves in the thick of battle.
But after about 4 minutes, I got a close hit.
After months of training, the men of Field Photo were finally dispatched all over the world.
One group would be shooting reconnaissance photographs. Somebody else would be doing post-production on another documentary. And Ford was the only guy who knew the whole equation of what was going on. So it was kind of chaotic, except Ford kept it all up in his skull.
Mark Armistead was sent to London to do reconnaissance along the front.
Our job was to compile from photographs, eyewitness accounts, postcards, old books, the whole range of the coast from Norway down.
It was a serious mission with a goofy nickname.
You gave a project that we call Ippy Dippy, Intelligence Documentary Photographic Project, and we just nicknamed it Ippy Dippy.
And Greg Toland, he was sent closer to home.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Remember, Ford learned about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor while dining at an admiral's house in D.C. He immediately sprang into action, sending Toland and a crew of filmmakers to capture the aftermath of the attack. As soon as he could, Ford went to Pearl Harbor himself to check on his team.
I was received very graciously by the Navy, my men and I, and when we arrived, the ship was still ablaze, and although we didn't photograph the attack, we got a lot of back coverage and showed the destruction.
Heartbreaking, the sight of ships built to fight and die proudly, now left burning in shallow graves.
Ford basically handed a football to Toland and said, let's see you run with it, and make the official government documentary about the greatest military catastrophe in American history.
The picture was actually directed and photographed by Greg Toland, who was one of our best Hollywood cameramen.
The film would be called December 7th, Ford's first real chance to show the military how his unit could help the cause beyond preventing syphilis.
And Toland disappeared for 6 months, 7 months, and came back with an 85-minute film that basically indicted the entire Japanese population of the West Coast as a fifth column.
A fifth column, essentially citizens who work against their own country. In his film, Toland cast every person in Oahu of Japanese descent as a potential spy for Japan.
Merchants, fishermen, storekeepers.
The Roosevelt administration was already under fire for its internment of Japanese Americans during the war.
The Army and Navy have been aware of the Japanese spy activities for years. They even have a little black book.
On top of the film's racism, it also wasn't really pro-American propaganda, which is why the military hired Ford's team in the first place. It's why they'd been allowed such autonomy. Instead, Toland's film pushed the message that the Navy had been asleep on the job, and Americans died as a result.
They had little to fear. They knew that our task forces were at sea. They knew that no long-distance airplane reconnaissance, no inshore airplane patrol was being maintained.
What Gregg Toland had done put the entire Field Photo Service on the defensive, because Toland went out and freelanced a film that neither the administration nor the OSS, i.e. Bill Donovan, wanted anything to do with.
Ford's unruly outfit made the Joint Chiefs of Staff nervous. They wanted movies that would make Americans support the fight, not undermine the war effort. So after the military brass saw December 7th, all that autonomy they'd been given got reeled back in. Toland's picture was put on the shelf, and Roosevelt decreed that all field photo material would now be subject to censorship. While all this was going down, Ford received news. He was being sent into battle. Navy Admiral Chester Nimitz called Ford and told him about a small island in the Pacific called Midway. Said the Navy had a hunch that action on the island was imminent. Nimitz wanted Ford there when it happened.
I was told to get aboard a certain destroyer and go to Midway. I didn't know what was up. But when I went down to the dock, the destroyer had left, and we got a speedboat, and we caught it up outside the harbor. We went on to Midway.
The war in the Pacific wasn't going well. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacks were relentless. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines. By land or by sea, the Americans were losing everywhere. And it appeared they were about to come under attack again. Ford was briefed on all this when he arrived on Midway.
He says they had broken the Japanese code, and the Japanese were prepared to attack Midway with a full naval force and a landing force. So he said, get ready.
It sounded ominous, but even at war, Ford mistrusted the men in charge. He left the briefing not quite sure what to think. Then he went to sleep.
I didn't quite believe him. I was rather dubious, skeptical about it. But somebody awakened me the next morning about 5:30, says the Japs are approaching.
Ford wasn't even dressed when the attack began. He jumped out of bed, grabbed his 16-millimeter camera, and scrambled outside. Then he climbed to the roof of the island's power station.
My job then was to take a position on top of the tower and report the number of planes. As far as I can figure, the approaching planes were 76. There were Zero, Zeeks, and light bombers, and they attacked it like a fury and blasted the islands.
It felt to Ford like the Japanese were coming directly after him.
It seems to me that their main objective was my tower. They simply slathered it full of bombs. I tried to take as many pictures as I could.
The enemy planes were flying so close, Ford claimed he could see a pilot grinning at him from the cockpit. Then, almost as soon as the battle began,
but after about 4 minutes, I got a close hit. And like a shrapnel wounds in my elbow and shoulder, and knocked unconscious.
Before he lost consciousness, Ford captured it all on camera. In the film, you can see a Japanese plane buzz the hangar, then a plume of black smoke fills the frame. A big chunk of debris flies right at the camera, causing it to shake. Not even getting hit by enemy fire deterred Ford.
I recovered after a few minutes to resume my photographing.
Even with his own life at risk, John Ford knew exactly the shots he wanted, and it wasn't the scenic footage he was known for. Instead, he told his assistant cameraman, "Don't worry about the combat footage. We can recreate that later. Focus on the soldiers' faces."
This really happened.
Ford wanted this film to capture the human impact of battle.
When the first raid passed, I got down and I photographed the anti-aircraft guns and faces of the Marines, and I'm raising the flag under, and under heavy bombardment.
As a historical document and as a work of movie making, the footage Ford shot on Midway was extraordinary. He didn't just film bombers and explosions, he showed the fear and bravery of the real people putting their lives on the line. Ford wasn't really in this for the propaganda the military was so keen on. He wanted to capture the horror of war. And with his first film from the front lines, he did. In the moment, though, there was a more immediate problem. Ford was bleeding. The shrapnel that struck him during the attack had ripped a 3-inch gash in his arm. But bombs had leveled the island's tiny hospital, so Ford was taken to a makeshift sick bay.
I reported to the sick bay where they doctored me up. Our hospital was hit. There was no medicine, no anesthesia.
Almost as soon as John Ford finally got to war, he was heading back home. Before he left, though, he hid all that footage and smuggled it off Midway without telling the military.
How he did it, I don't know. I suspect that he said it was a box of cigars or so. I don't know.
John Ford would make this film in secret. We'll have that when we come back. When John Ford got injured at the Battle of Midway, he was sent home to Los Angeles, where his daughter Barbara helped care for him.
And he came and he was terribly wounded. I mean, he was really wounded.
Ford turned to his usual crutch, whiskey and mariachi music.
And he always walked around in a sheet. And Daddy used to play one record over and over and over again. It was Pancho Villa.
Drunk and erratic, he was a difficult patient, even more irritable than usual. Barbara was worn out, so an old friend stepped in to help.
Every night on his way home, Duke would come by, and he said, "I'll take my turn."
Duke, John Wayne. He was shooting a movie at the time and had a wife and 4 young kids at home. Still, every night, he would swing by the Ford house and relieve Barbara from duty.
And he was in makeup and wardrobe and everything.
Barbara would rush out the door for a brief respite with a friend.
We'd go to the Hollywood Derby and would have dinner. And Duke sat there and played this da-da-da-dee-dee-dee-dee Pancho Villa song.
Wayne had not signed up to fight in the war, a decision John Ford clearly disapproved of. Still, when his friend needed him, John Wayne was there. Wayne and Ford had been close now for better than 15 years. They were more than friends. They were almost family at that point.
He's always saying that I directed him in pictures and I directed his life. Well, that's a broad statement, but this is partly true. He lost his father early in life, but I think there's more of a father image to him. And I accepted it.
That said, this was John Ford. John Wayne may have seen Ford as a father figure, but this was no doting father-son relationship.
See, the thing about the relationship between Ford and Wayne, there was a public aspect to the relationship and there was a private aspect to the relationship.
Ford biographer Scott Eyman again.
Privately, if you read the correspondence between them, Ford is a loving father figure, almost invariably supportive, affectionate, but in public, he didn't feel he could afford to be like that.
Fortunately for all his weary helpers, Ford recovered quickly. Within days, he was on a plane back to Washington, anxious to return to work. After all, he had just filmed the most important footage of the war so far, and Ford wanted to make sure it got into production without military censorship. Ford had smuggled his footage out of Midway so the Navy wouldn't confiscate it and try to micromanage or censor the production. Ford met up with Robert Parrish, who he'd asked to help produce the Midway movie. Ford showed up with a bandage on his left arm, carrying several cans of 16mm color film.
So he said, "Would you look at this with me?" And we sat down and I ran it with him, and he said, "Now, what do you think of it?"
Parrish could tell the raw footage was exciting, but Ford gave him the same instructions he'd given the cameraman on Midway. This film needed to reflect the human sacrifices of war. Ford knew the Navy might not want that. Fortunately, Ford had experience dodging authority. Not only did he smuggle the footage out of Midway with him, he then told Robert Parrish to take the film far from Washington where no one could interfere.
Then he handed it to me and he said, "Here, take this and start organizing it the way we've talked. But don't do it here, go to California." And I said, "Well, should I report to the Navy barracks there?" And he said, "No, I think you ought to report to your mother. Go live at your mother's house." He knew that the bureaucracy would catch up and they would say, "Do you have any film here that was brought back?" And he could say no, he didn't.
Robert Parrish left for California with the mandate to create a film for the mothers of America, to show them the war as it really was. When Parrish handed in the documentary just a week later, the battle itself took up only a few minutes of the 18-minute film.
The next morning, divine services were held beside a bomb crater that had once been a chapel.
One amazing thing about the Battle of Midway is that it's a pretty short movie, but the last third of it is so much about loss.
Film historian Mark Harris.
It's about military funerals. It's about the idea that some of those young men who we see at the very beginning of the movie laughing and playing around on this island did not come back.
Frank Fessler? That's 13 for Frank.
And it would have been so easy for a filmmaker not to show that part, just to end the movie on a note of victory. But that's not how the Battle of Midway plays out. After you see it, you can't shake the idea that these men have been hurt, these men have been hospitalized, some of them have been lost, that it cost something tremendous to do what they did. And that was Ford.
Good luck. God bless you, son.
It was exactly the film John Ford wanted, to show not just the glory of victory, but its cost. However, that wasn't what the military wanted Americans thinking about. So Ford took an unusual route to make sure his movie didn't get censored. He set up a screening for FDR at the White House. Ford was convinced that if he could get the president to see the film just as it was, he'd leave it alone. To further his cause, Ford made an important addition to the film. Robert Parrish again.
Oh, then he gave me a little roll of film and he said, "Don't look at this and don't put it in the picture until I tell you to." And of course, the first thing I did, as soon as I got out of the cutting room, I looked at it immediately. And it was a shot taken on Midway of Jimmy Roosevelt, who at that time was a major in the Marine Corps, and actually was there.
FDR's son, Jimmy Roosevelt, fought on Midway. Ford had filmed a few close-up frames of him during the battle. At the last minute, Ford asked Robert Parrish to add that footage.
And just before the White House running, he said, "Now put this in."
Parrish quickly spliced the frames into the finished film. Then Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor settled in for the screening, along with a small group of advisors.
Navy planes roared from the decks of our carriers, Army bombers, Marines.
All eyes were on the president.
Roosevelt would say, "Oh yes, that's B-17, and he kept, and he had a lot to say about the film.
At eventide, we buried our heroic dead. The last...
Then when Jimmy Roosevelt's picture came up. Everything was silent, dead silent.
Major Roosevelt.
Nobody spoke from the time that shot was on the screen until the end. And then Roosevelt turned to Admiral Leahy, who was his senior aide, and said, I want every American to see this film as soon as possible.
Many Americans did see the film that fall of 1942, the realities of war and loss projected on screens across the country. Ford's instincts were right. The following March, the Academy Awards honored the film. It won the first Oscar in a new category, Best Documentary. Ford, of course, was unavailable to attend the ceremony, but he sent a Navy commander to pick up the statue.
The Battle of Midway is a further evidence of the splendid contribution being made by the motion picture industry to the overall war effort, and for which the Navy is most grateful.
After the success of Midway, Ford went on to start repairing the damage of his Pearl Harbor film, the one that made the Navy so angry. He took out the racist parts, most of them anyway, and then the Navy approved the new version, as did the Academy.
Whether the picture won the Academy Award, I don't know. Did it?
Yeah, it did. Best Documentary Short Subject. Ford was now up to 5 Oscars. Did he show up to accept the award this time? Take a guess. In April 1944, Wild Bill Donovan recommended that John Ford be promoted to captain. Then Wild Bill handed Ford the most dangerous assignment of his life.
When Ford was reapproached in Washington and told, we want you to go to Europe, he was very, very happy about it.
Ford was told the Allies were planning an invasion of Nazi-occupied France, D-Day. After what he'd done with Midway, Donovan wanted Ford's men to document it. So John Ford made his way to Normandy, where he filmed one of the most significant battles of the 20th century. At least, we think he did. No one knows for sure. Ford told people for decades, until the day he died, that he shot a movie on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. But not 1 minute of that film was ever shown anywhere in America. Some wonder if it ever existed at all.
I have been looking and looking for this film, and I have never found anything.
We wondered too.
What it would mean to find that footage is literally incalculable.
So we traveled halfway around the world and across Europe to find it.
And I think that there could well be footage in British archives. Maybe the Imperial War Museum.
If a package had arrived for Stalin from Mr. John Ford, Stalin would have watched it. So that's the next thing I'd go for.
It doesn't seem very probable to me.
So I think it's possible that there is a film.
That's next week on The Plot Thickens. Angela Carone is our director of podcasts. Story editor is Karen Duffin. Jaco Friedman is our senior producer. Script writing by Jaco Friedman, Maya Croth, and James Sheridan, who also fact-checked every episode for us. Audio editing and sound design by Brandon Arnold, James Kim, and Mike Voulgaris. Mixing by Glenn Matullo. Research by Matt Goldberg. Production support from Liz Winter, Allison Fire, Matthew Ownby, Julie Baton, Emma Morris, Susan Bisak, Dory Stegman, and Phil Richards. Thanks to our legal team, John Renaud and Kristen Hassel. And to the talents of TCM staffers Darren Jacobs, Katie Daniels, David Byrne, Diana Bosch, Caroline Wigmore, Michelle Height, Stephanie Thames, and to our resident Ford scholar, Scott McGee. Our executive producer is Charlie Tavish. Special thanks to Dan Ford for sharing his family archive with us. and to the helpful team at Indiana University's Lilly Library. From Novel, thanks to producer Philippa Goodrich, story editor Veronica Simmons, researcher Valeria Rocca, assistant producer Nadia Mehdi, production managers Cherie Houston and Charlotte Wolfe, executive producer Max O'Brien, and creative director Millard Foxton. Thomas Avery of Tune Welders composed our theme music. I'm your host, Ben Mankiewicz. Thanks for listening. See you next time.